Hello, I'm John Quinn. I'm the Global Brand Ambassador for Tullamore D.E.W Irish Whiskey. Sorry I can't be with you for your presentation. However, I know you're in good hands. To make up for my absence, I'd like to take you through the process of making whiskey, especially Irish whiskey. On the face of it, whiskey making is very straightforward. For ingredients, we just need grain and water and yeast. We mash the grain and water together to make a sugary liquid to which we add the yeast, and fermentation happens to give us a type of beer. This is a sour beer, not great for drinking, but wonderful for distilling. We then distill the beer by boiling it to a point where we produce an alcohol-rich vapor that gets condensed back to liquid. This is a stronger and more pure liquid. We call it spirit. Now in Ireland, we repeat that process 2 more times, triple distillation. But the resultant spirit can't be called whiskey until it's had time to mature in old oak casks for several years. It's that simple. But whiskey is also very complex. And if you've tasted different whiskies, you'll know there are many different styles and flavors out there. Coconut and vanilla bourbons from the United States. Peaty, smoky styles from the Western Isles of Scotland. Rich, oily pot still whiskies from Ireland. The reason for the different tastes is that at every stage of the whiskey making process, there are differences in the way things are done. The differences occur from one country to another, from one region to another in the same country, and even between neighbouring distillers. For example, in the USA, they use corn to make whiskey. In Ireland and Scotland, barley is the main flavouring grain. In parts of Scotland, they like to peat the grain to produce a smoky whiskey, whereas in Ireland, we prefer a fresher, sweeter style of whiskey. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at the process of making Tullamore D.E.W. In Tullamore D.E.W, we have 3 types of whiskies: malt, pot still, and grain. These are blended together to produce that unmistakably smooth Tullamore D.E.W taste. Let's look at the differences between these 3 whiskey types. We'll start with the malt whiskey. This begins with Irish barley malt. Malt just means that the barley has been tricked into starting to grow by making it damp. Each grain swells and begins to put out a little shoot. The reason for doing this is to begin the process that turns starch in the grain into sugar, which is vital for making alcohol. The malted barley is dried, ground up, and mixed with hot water in a mash tun into a kind of thick porridge. This turns the starch in the grain into soluble sugars, which are drained off in a syrupy liquid called wort. The wort is mixed with a small amount of yeast, which grows and grows, feeding off the sugars and turning them into alcohol. After a couple of days, this becomes a strong, sour beer. Distilling is about heating up the beer, now called wash, until the alcohol in it turns to steam and rises up the neck of the pot still. It's then funneled away down a line arm and condensed into liquid again. This creates an alcohol that is purer and stronger than the initial beer. To make it purer and stronger still, at Tullamore D.E.W, we repeat this process a further 2 times. The spirit at this stage is perfectly clear and a bit feisty. It needs a bit of time to settle down and mature. The spirit is put into oak casks to let the flavours develop and round out for several years. The wood also imparts the golden or amber hue. Over time, we discovered through experience that our spirit was best matured in casks that had previously held bourbon or sherry. The process of making Tullamore D.E.W's pot still whiskey is almost identical to making the malt whiskey. The one difference is right at the beginning of the process. As well as malted barley, unmalted barley is also used. Pot still whisky is unique to Ireland and is very different from malt whisky in its flavour. It is oilier than the malt and has a wonderful linseed and slightly spicy character. The third whisky type, grain whisky, is different again from malt and pot still. Firstly, rather than barley alone, we also use corn to make the mash. The fermentation of these grains to create a beer follows a similar path to the malt and pot still, but the distillation process is the second big difference. Grain whisky is distilled in a cullen still. This effectively distills the spirit over and over again, raising its purity. Finally, the spirit is drawn off and piped into casks for maturation to become whisky. Like malt and pot still whisky, grain whisky is matured in oak casks. In Ireland, the minimum period for maturation is 3 years, but of course many whiskies are matured for much longer than this. The final part of making Tullamore D.E.W whisky is blending. There is a whole art to this process, but at its very core is the mixing of casks of malt, pot still and grain whiskies to create a harmonious spirit that combines the rich flavours of the malt and pot still whiskies with the silky sweet smoothness of the grain. Once that has been perfected, the goal is consistency, maintaining traditions and standards to keep the whisky tasting as good as it did the first time, year after year, decade after decade.